Welcome to No Room for Phonies, episode
57.
And we're calling this The Trouble with Status.
Good title.
Because I couldn't find anything good about seeking status in your life. So, and I did quite a bit of reading.
The status of being statusless.
Yeah. Yeah, that's... Anyway, the green light moment for me is, I've been thinking about this a lot, but it's just the idea that everyone is really trying the best they can with the resources that they have available to them.
And sometimes it feels like they don't have many resources.
Well, sometimes probably people feel that way about us.
I know.
So, and from their own level of consciousness, and that you need to show yourself and everyone else compassion and make life work for you and kind of choose your own way. And we have these two little guys that
5 years old.
5 years old that come, they're twins that come, and we were having dinner, and I don't know what the subject came up, but they talked about being itchy and that you just have to get your mind off things.
Yeah.
And I thought, well, that kind of just reminded me that, you know, if 5-year-old children can do the best they can with the resources that they have and
self-regulate
and their own level of consciousness, that we can all do that, and that we need to believe that everyone is trying the very best that they can given wherever they're at in life and what they've gone through.
Unconditional positive regard.
Yeah. So anyway, that was listening to those two little guys was kind of my green light moment for this round. And my book recommendation it's called No Cure for Being Human and Other Truths I Need to Hear. And the author is Kate Bowler. And she's also my podcast recommendation, because her podcast is called Everything Happens, and then beside it says For a Reason, and it's crossed out because it's just, she talks to a lot of people about how they manage during dark and difficult times. And if you read her book, it is definitely like she goes through
and it counters that whole thing that dark and difficult things happen for a reason.
Yeah.
Like, oh, we're supposed to grow from it.
No.
Or God is throwing our way to help us be better. And
her book just highlights the idea that we are all human, and we just do, which kind of goes with my green light moment, that we just do the best we can to get through things. Yeah. And that we have faith that we can manage whatever kind of comes our way. But it's a cancer story, so I will warn you about that, but because some people don't want anything to do with that. But it's also a story about being human when you're going through something really, 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 really difficult. So I would highly recommend it as a book to read. And her podcast as well, just to hear. She talks to all kinds of different people and whatever. So the trouble with status. So status is seeking approval.
At its basicness.
At its basicness. And it's competitive in nature as individuals desire to receive more respect and deference from other people. It means like...
But it's also seeking approval from yourself.
Yes.
Right? Like if you...
Well, you're comparing yourself. But and that becomes the next part of it, that you're never satisfied. You're always striving for some level of superiority.
Okay. And this goes across a whole bunch of different areas of our life.
Yeah, like meaning that you're kind of thinking of yourself ahead of others, meaning that you own or you do things based on how other people will view them. Mm-hmm. Like always having to have the newest car or the best car, or when... Right. You know, when electric cars come out, the status of owning an electric car. Mm-hmm. And some people don't do things for status, mm-hmm. but means that you expect to be respected because of what you're able to own, or what your job is, or what you say you know or read or do. Mm-hmm. So, you know, like...
Well, it's not just ownership. It's you can feel superior about the way you believe or the way you
Well,
act.
and I think, like, I'm just thinking of of experiences that I've had with people where, you know, you start talking about books you've read, and that person has read all the books and has the interpretation of all the books and has to come across as if they know what is really the best book to read or
the best interpretation.
Yeah, of the book. Yeah. And it means that you're pursuing a life from an external gratification perspective rather than just growing as a person and being who you are. Mm-hmm. And then people who are status driven feel that as long as they're doing some kind of external achievement, then they're okay. Mm-hmm. So everything is basically for show.
Right. But that can, so like your glass castles can tumble so quickly. And then
well, I mean, there's got to be more meat to you than just everything you're balancing on. It's like building your house on sand, building your house on a firm foundation. So in comparison, like this is something I read in Brene Brown's new book, Atlas of the Heart. I haven't read the whole book, but I kind of like
it's meant to be more like an atlas where you can pick and choose and go around.
So I went in and I read about comparison, and she talks about comparison as being the crush of conformity. So from one side and competition from the other. So you want to conform on one end, mm-hmm. and then but you're competing on the other. So it's that idea. It's trying to
That's like summed up as high school right there.
Yeah, it's simultaneously trying to fit in and stand out.
Yeah, that sounds like a teenager.
But how many times have we been involved in groups? Like I think of our old knitting group.
Yeah,
and that whole idea of like fitting in but standing out mm-hmm. all at the same time and not just relaxing and enjoying the people that you're with and not worrying about how you're, you know, just if your moral compass is that you are kind and compassionate, mm-hmm. then that's just who you are mm-hmm. for no other reason than to just, but not to be. So, so comparison says it, is like to be, you're like everyone else, but you're just that little bit better. So if our goal is actually in our lives, like one of my goals is actually meaningful connection, then seeking status, it does not ever allow you to be meaningfully connected to somebody because you're never really listening to understand. You're always just trying to one-up them. Mm-hmm. Right?
Yeah. Absolutely.
So, you know, the cost of status seeking is that there's all kinds of social problems, right? Because this is where the gaps between rich and poor come. Mm-hmm. And they even talk about in the research higher mortality rates and crime rates and morbidity and infants and all that sort of stuff just from the pursuit of status.
Particularly the external things, like
because it takes time and energy away from like leisure time and social time and other healthy, productive
just think of
things.
Of like that people that go bankrupt because they've had to have so many things they racked up their credit cards mm-hmm. and couldn't handle it. Mm-hmm. Like that's still, a lot of the examples we're talking about now are external status things, like things you own, but there's also like an internal status where you think that you're better than others.
Right. You've got to have the latest like book to, you know, to have read or I mean, in our case, the top of the line this or the top of the line that. And a lot of it is in owning stuff, or you have to pursue a PhD because then I can say I have a PhD. Yeah. Not that there isn't an end goal in certain things. Like, I'm not saying that every person that pursues a PhD is seeking status, but there mm-hmm. isn't a way that people are mm-hmm. that, you know, I'm going to own this car.
Well, some people collect status by who they know.
Absolutely.
Like the networkers who are...
The gathering of professionals around you, which is a whole thing, right? Yeah. But... so the status hypothesis, which is some research by Eugene, I don't know how you say it, Wei, W-E-I. How does the signaling of status impact our behavior? It is about being looked up to by others. And so even minimalism has become a status trend.
Yeah.
Right?
If my house is as sparser than everybody else's house and looks more Icelandic or whatever, then you have more status.
Well, and the idea of, being able to live on a little bit of money and all that piece of, that's all status-y as well. And retiring early because you have all this,
that can happen.
That you can feel that way. And I don't mean that everybody who does it is status seeking, but these are the things we have to guard our hearts against. And I think that's where Atlas of the Heart comes in. Like when we talk about, when you talk about that book, The Five Voices, right? There's the voice, and then there's the dark side of the voice. And so,
or the author puts it the mature and the immature, but then he also says the weaponizing of the voice.
So I think that's what we just have to, and we can get caught up in these short-term status games, like on social media, where you get, well, here's my picture of what I did, and then here's my picture of what I did. But there are long-term status gains, and our decision can be shaped by some of those short-term status gains that lead us into playing like a long-term, if we're not cognizant about what's really important in our lives. If we don't know ourselves and what are our principles and values and what our moral compass is. And
I think all of us are vulnerable to slip into some of those short-term ones at different times.
Right.
I know.
Well, and it's when we feel pressure to do things that just position ourselves beside our peers. Like,
the tricky thing for me was back when I was trying to build a design business, you had to be one of the cool kids to get a lot of followers, to get a lot of people to buy your designs to make an income. So then, but I was torn between being true to myself and my aesthetic and trying to be the cool kid.
Right. And there are some professions that push you
towards that. Well, and the thing is, it didn't work for me because if I'd get all wound up in the status, then I'd be upset and miserable. So then I'd say, okay, don't pay attention to status. It's not being really helpful to you. And then it was just a back and forth.
Well, and I mean,
I'm glad to be teaching.
I feel like, I actually feel like that, like about when I became a principal, right? Like,
there were at the principals meetings, right? There were some principals that were like,
well, I don't wipe kids' noses, or I don't do this because I'm not going out on duty. I became a principal, so I didn't have to go out on duty. Right. And a lot of that behavior was rewarded. Like, those of us that were sloggers, that were willing to like teach and do stuff and, get our hands dirty, were actually looked down. Well, you don't really get what it means to be a principal then.
So then they had made up some kind of status to that.
And if we're introspective about status, making sure that we are making life decisions by minimizing the role of status and thinking more about the long-term effects of things on our lives as a whole. Like, that's where, and sometimes we spend time overthinking actions and decisions based on what other people think, instead of just moving on, maybe admitting a mistake as necessary, and just becoming more self-aware and self-regulated. Yeah,
I wish I had not cared so much about what people thought when I was in my 30s, because it's a lot easier now. But I mean, that's a trend too. As you age, you care less.
Right.
But it would be.
But I also think that it is a part of this whole idea that when you know yourself and you know what your values are and then it's harder for someone to sway you. And sometimes I can listen to someone going on and on about something that they have or own or are going to buy or get or whatever. And I think, wow, that's really nice for you. Mm-hmm. And not feel like, wow, because I remember sometimes when we were really poor thinking, oh, they can go on a trip and they can do this and they can do that. Yeah.
But that's the effect of status on comparing and not being able to match up.
And then that goes back to this whole thing where we're saying, like, you're wasting, you're never satisfied, right? Mm-hmm. And instead of doing something like productive and healthy and whatever, then you're sitting around going, oh, I wish I could have what they have.
Yeah.
So,
well, what about the times when I loved socializing with people who were well-read, but they also were into good food and probably had traveled. So they obviously had more money, but I liked hanging out with them. Not because I wanted to be like them. I just found them more interesting, and I didn't have to talk about like the other topics that I don't know.
Well, and I think what we
and
have...
You kind of said, well, you're trying to be like them. And I'm like, no, I don't want to be like them. I just like hanging out. I like hanging out with them. I think
our common complaint between you and I was you sometimes acting like you were like, didn't know things. And like asking people all these questions like you didn't know things. And I was like, you're feeding into their like status thing by like, and I'm not going to feed into anybody's status. Well, and that's the difference.
Your radar, your schmooze radar is really strong. Yeah. But for me, I was using that as a coping mechanism for not knowing what to talk about and making light conversation. So it was like, my strategy was ask somebody a question
and the other thing,
and then let them talk and then sound excited about what they're talking about. And then I don't have to worry about it.
And I think that became...
It's an introvert strategy.
I think, though, that became the thing when we were with people who really didn't want to engage in deep conversation.
Yeah.
They just wanted to talk about what they knew, what they...
owned, what they bought.
They want... It's kind of being in a whole room
but I did get bored with that.
Yes. So strategies to shed the whole status thing, because there's always a mean voice in your head that can undermine your self-confidence. So then you have to actually work at replacing those harsh thoughts with positive reflections that focus on your own purpose and values. And just like those little kids saying, you can stop thinking about certain things. Right. If you're itchy, you can stop. You can think about something else.
Yeah, and get your mind off.
Get your mind off of it, right? And you don't have to listen to those random voices around you that push status. Like you can limit your time on social media and not get involved in and find people in your life who are authentic and transparent and people who share your values. And I will tell you 100% that your main group of people will shrink.
Yes. Yeah, it will.
It will, like majorly probably. And for me, I always there's a whole thing about checking the accuracy of what you believe or what you see, right? So somebody says something, you say, wow. And then you find out, well, maybe that's not exactly how...
Right, but you have to have balance. Otherwise, you can just become so cynical.
Right. But I think that's just to check accuracy and listen to different perspectives and know that the thing is, it's that belief in your head that you are good enough and as good as anybody else. So if they have a $400,000 investment and I have a $100,000 investment or zero, that doesn't make me any less of a person.
Right.
Because my life circumstances may have contributed to that.
Right.
Right? Like, it doesn't just mean that I don't know how to invest or I'm this or that.
No, it's just...
People can get
we all started from different points.
Somebody else could have gotten $200,000 from their parents. And you have to actually practice rejecting status. Like, you have to practice and say, whoa, that's a whole status thing that I don't need to.
Well, I think even just being really practical when you're shopping and you take out the debit or credit card, it's like, stop, like, am I buying this because of status?
Well, and the other thing is, I read a meme the other day that said we spend the first half of our lives accumulating stuff and the second half of our lives getting rid of the stuff that we thought we needed to accumulate. Right. So... there is that whole, and just not comparing yourself to others.
Yeah.
Like, not comparing yourself to others and just making your decisions based on what you know is right for you.
Yeah.
So.
Which I think makes it easier then if somebody has more statusy things or wealth or whatever, and they're like, oh, I'm going to Italy for 3 months. You can sincerely be happy for them.
Yeah. Yeah, it's not about going, I'm happy you're going to Italy. I don't want to go to Italy.
Or I might want to go to Italy. I know I never will, but that's okay.
That's okay. I've got other things.
For me, it doesn't have to be, I don't want to.
No, true. I just think about the whole idea of wanderlust, right?
Well, when you're not a wanderluster.
But when people start that whole thing, oh, if you don't travel, then you're missing out on life and blah, blah, and on and on and on.
Yeah, I know.
And I think, that is so not true. It's not necessarily true, right? So, and this is where you have to try to understand why you're seeking the approval or the experience or the thing, right? You have to actually go inside your own head.
Right.
Am I really dissatisfied with my life? Do I not feel I have a purpose? Do I have things that that I feel I'm actually missing out on? And if you do, then you have to challenge yourself to figure it out so you don't live a life of fear and regret. Like if you really are feeling like, oh, in my life I'm missing out on
and if you do think, oh, traveling would be really valuable for me or whatever, then you have to start making the sacrifices and saving the money and setting it aside.
Yeah. And I mean, we've
fine.
seen this even in COVID, right? The people who have already traveled.
Yeah.
And we're like, ooh, we wouldn't do that.
Mm-hmm.
But I don't care whether they do or not.
No.
I mean, at the beginning, I was kind of like, can you not bring more variance back here? And do you really need to do this right now? But in general, I'm free to let people kind of, evaluate their risk factor on their own.
Well, it's funny because then there's status in that. Like there's the group that, well, like the more risks you take, the higher status you are, right? Like the risk, the adrenaline addicts, they that's a status thing. I've climbed this mountain, I've jumped out of this airplane, whatever.
But it really is about how you present yourself, right? And status is more. Somebody can be sharing something that they've done, not feeling any status about it.
But somebody can react to it.
But when you are sitting there comparing yourself to them, you almost put them in a status position without them even wanting to be in one.
Yeah.
And I think one of the things they suggest is like write down 5 if you're really struggling with status, write down 5 accomplishments every day to shift your focus from what others are doing to what you're actually doing and accomplishing, right? So, and I think that's especially true for like sometimes these young moms and like, oh, this mother's doing this and doing that and doing that. Well, we all have to live our lives.
Pull back into the whole shame cycle too.
Right. Yeah. And I mean, I particularly, when I was raising our kids, I didn't even have a car.
Nope.
So like, I had to really suck it up when it came to being around other moms who, had cars and had money and could take their kids here and there and everywhere. And I just had to be honest and say, no, we have to keep our lives simple because, and I didn't feel status in it, but I learned that I was doing the best I can. And there were things that I could do, that I focused more on making sure that my kids were getting as much as I could offer
whatever
them.
We could offer them.
And that every kid doesn't have to have the same experience growing up, for sure. And so that comes into just keeping everything in your life realistic and not to let other people make you feel bad. Because you can also keep a little bit of your life private and only share with people who deserve to hear your story, right? Like I didn't have to deal with the social media piece.
With our kids, no.
With our kids because it didn't exist. But there is something to, like every single experience that you have in your life does not have to become a social media event. So, and you don't have to buy into everybody else's social media events. I think positive affirmations are good to being thankful and build other people up and compliment, like what you're saying. Say, wow, that is wonderful, and genuinely mean it. Not like, oh, well, I wish I could.
Right.
Like, again, we go back to my green light moment of actually...
They're doing the best they can with what they have.
Right. And also knowing that it's a mindset thing, right? Because status seeking is all about your mindset and the social media part. And then another one is like, and that's what used to make me what crazy about you. I didn't want you to come out like you were almost needing someone else's opinion or someone else's, like, that's what would drive me crazy. But why do you care about that? Like, that person's opinion. And then you'd be like, oh, hanging on every word. And I'd be like, what in the world? Like, that would drive me crazy. But I get why. But I think sometimes...
I was just celebrating them.
Yeah, whatever. But I think sometimes we do need to pause before we speak and just kind of...
Yes.
Sometimes...
Well, and the other thing is we have to be careful about judging somebody else for being status driven, because we really don't know all the time whether they do what they do because they want status or just because they enjoy that.
I like it. I like doing it this way. Well, it would be like me saying...
You've had some comments sometimes about your cooking and entertaining and hosting, like, how many dinner parties do you have a month? And how could, like...
Yeah.
Like...
Well, and just the idea that
it was almost like they thought that we were seeking status because we were showing off new recipes.
And meanwhile, that's what we just like to do, right? And I think that is the idea of accepting yourself for who you are, and, you know, that you don't have to be right all the time and you don't have to need all the answers, but you can just know yourself and your positive traits and the things you like. And then just by being kind to yourself and trusting yourself and building confidence and relying less on status and approval and more on who you are inside yourself, and not worrying about, like, you know.
I'm trying to think back to those incidents. I don't really think that I thought that I was low status or below. I don't know. And
I don't know. It was just the way
I know
you came across. It was like... Really? And there would be some questions that you would ask, and I would think, you already know that. Like, why are you asking
Making conversation.
It just didn't feel authentic.
Well, that's what bothers you.
Right?
That's a whole nother issue.
So, and I think
Next topic, authenticity. No, not really.
No, it's not. Ambition is like just to be always simplifying things and keeping and decluttering your space and your mind and focusing on one thing at a time. All of those things.
So your space is more decluttered than my space.
No, but that's how you can fight that.
Yes, yeah.
That's how your mind can be free enough to go, I don't need to engage right now in this. This is just, I don't need to get into a spot where I'm trying to one up somebody or there's nothing I need to share. Like, sometimes I think we feel like we need to share something because somebody, I'm traveling here. Well, I'm doing this. Well, I'm doing this. Well, I'm doing this. Well, I'm doing this.
Right.
And then it just goes back and forth instead of just, living mindfully in the present and being positive and being creative and original and developing new perspectives and only competing with yourself. Because really, that's all we
enough.
need. Well, it's like Coach Kozak always. The only competition is what's in the mirror. Yeah. Like, it doesn't matter about anybody else. And you just need to, it's you that you need to.
Shout out to HasFit.
Yeah, shout out to
our
HasFit.
Exercise coaches on YouTube.
But, and I think status comes down to that very thing. Compete only with yourself. And face your fears and your trouble and those thoughts that trouble you, and know who you are, and just become better tomorrow than you are today, which is a recurring theme in our stuff. So that's our advice on status. And so next podcast, we're going to talk about what does active living look like for us.
Okay. Sounds good.
All the various things that we have tried.
Yeah, we're so much more active than a lot of you. That's our style.
No, we're not. We're so much more trying to figure out how to have an active...
I'm just pulling your whatever thing.
Whatever. Because we know that your mind works better when you're active and all the kinds of things that we do to try to stay healthy. So I just thought it would be good for us to talk about that.
Sounds good.
All right. Well, thanks for joining us on all the things that are bad about status and how you can combat it by being happy with yourself.
That sounds
basically, isn't it?
It is.
It's about just being happy with yourself in your life and getting through stuff, right? So thanks for joining us here on No Room for Phonies and the trouble with status.
Good night. You're not spamming.
Well, what if they listen to it in the morning? You said good night.
Doesn't matter. That's podcast land.
Okay, podcast.
You want me to leave this in as a blooper?
Yes. That's funny.